The town called her a monster in Burlap, until the Sioux hunter tore it off and saw the truth beneath. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's tale. The town had never been kind to her. Sarah Harper was an outcast in every sense of the word. She had moved to the small frontier town of Blackstone in the summer of 1845, hoping to make a fresh start. A widow with no family and only the clothes on her back, she was eager to find peace after the tragic death of her husband, Henry. But instead of finding refuge, she found judgment. The people of Blackstone, who once whispered with curiosity about the new widow, soon turned their backs on her when rumors started to spread. They called her the monster in Burlap, a name that clung to her like the rough, faded cloth she wore. The fabric, a cheap burlap sack she had managed to piece together, became a symbol of her poverty and supposed lowliness in their eyes. Every day, she could hear their harsh whispers, their cruel stares, and the mocking laughter that followed her wherever she went. It seemed like no matter how hard she tried to contribute, to be a part of their community, she was forever marked by the shroud of her poverty. Sarah tried to keep her head down, but the isolation weighed heavily on her. She had a small cottage on the outskirts of town, a tiny refuge where she worked tirelessly to survive, mending clothes for the locals in exchange for food and supplies. But every time she ventured into town, the jeers followed. The men at the local tavern mocked her silently. The women crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. It was as though she was invisible to them, not worthy of their time or kindness. Her only solace was the quiet evenings spent alone in her cabin, where she could forget the world's cruelty for a little while. One chilly afternoon, as she walked down the main street to pick up some flour from the local store, something happened. The usual snide comments from the townsfolk were absent, but the silence in the air was almost worse. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she felt eyes on her, but not the usual mocking gaze. These were different eyes, piercing, intense, and filled with something she couldn't quite place. Turning slowly, she saw him. A Sioux hunter stood across the street, his figure cloaked in a long, weathered cloak. His face was stoic, unreadable, but there was something about his presence that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. Sarah's hand instinctively tightened around the small bundle of flour she had just purchased. She had heard whispers about Native Americans traveling through the area, but she had never seen one so close. His dark eyes held her gaze for a moment longer than she felt comfortable, before he turned and walked into the woods behind the town, vanishing into the trees. But as he left, a thought lingered in Sarah's mind. He hadn't seen her as others did. There was no contempt in his eyes, no disgust. Just a quiet observation. For the first time since arriving in Blackstone, Sarah felt seen, not for her burlap sack or her poverty, but simply for who she was. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a life-changing encounter. The next day, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of the Sioux hunter's gaze. She had hoped to put it out of her mind, but the thought of being seen by someone, truly seen, made her heart race in a way she hadn't expected. It was almost as if, in that brief moment, someone had acknowledged her humanity beyond the burlap and the whispers. She found herself standing at the edge of the woods that evening, her gaze fixed on the trees where the man had disappeared. What was it that had drawn her to the forest? Curiosity, perhaps, or the strange feeling that something was about to change. The evening air was cool as the sun dipped behind the horizon, and she took a deep breath, hoping for a sense of clarity. That's when she heard it. A rustling sound from the thicket nearby. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stand still, hoping it was just the wind. Then, she saw him. The Sioux hunter, emerging from the shadows with the same quiet grace as before. This time, he was not alone. A young girl, no older than 12, appeared beside him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. The hunter's gaze swept over Sarah briefly before he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging her presence. Sarah froze. Her instincts told her to run, but something in his eyes made her stay. The girl, her face smeared with dirt, looked equally uncertain but did not step back. Instead, she stepped forward slowly, keeping her eyes on the ground. The hunter spoke first, his voice low but calm. "You are the one who saved him," he said, his gaze now fully focused on Sarah. "I see you are not what they say." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people in the town," he continued, "they call you names. But I see you are more than they understand." He stepped closer, the sound of his boots crunching against the dry leaves underfoot. "I was not expecting to find someone like you here." Sarah felt a mix of confusion and gratitude. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she could sense the sincerity in his words. She glanced at the girl, who had finally lifted her head and met Sarah's gaze. The girl's eyes were full of sadness, but there was something else in them, an unspoken understanding, as if she too knew what it felt like to be seen for the first time. "What are you doing here?" Sarah finally asked, her voice steadier now. The hunter looked at the girl, then back at Sarah. "She is my sister," he said. "Her family was taken from us by the raiders. We are alone." The hunter's words hung heavy in the air. Sarah could feel the weight of his pain, and a strange sense of empathy began to grow within her. "I can help," Sarah said without thinking, stepping closer. "I know the woods. I can guide you both." The hunter's eyes softened slightly. "You would help us?" he asked, his tone skeptical yet hopeful. Sarah nodded, her heart beating faster. "I may not have much, but I can help you find shelter and food. No one should be alone in these woods." The hunter studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "But you must understand, the town is not safe for you, either. The raiders are not the only danger here." Sarah's eyes widened, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" The hunter's expression grew darker. "There are those in this town who would harm you if they knew the truth." He motioned to the girl. "She has been through much, and they would see her as a prize, not a person. You are not safe here, either." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She had known that the town was unforgiving, but she had never thought of herself as a target. She had always kept her head down, done the work, and stayed out of trouble. But now, with the hunter's words ringing in her ears, she realized just how precarious her position really was. The girl took a tentative step forward, her hand brushing Sarah's arm. "Will you help us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sarah looked from the girl to the hunter and made up her mind. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I will help. We'll find a way to keep you safe." The hunter gave her a small nod of approval, but there was something else in his eyes, an unspoken gratitude. The weight of the moment settled over Sarah. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a purpose, a reason to stand tall in a world that had forgotten her. As they turned to leave the woods, Sarah felt the cool evening air press against her skin. She wasn't sure how this journey would end, but for the first time in years, she was no longer alone. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, casting a golden hue across the forest, Sarah found herself standing at the edge of the woods once more. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and for the first time in days, she felt a strange sense of peace. The Sioux hunter and the young girl, who had introduced herself as Tala, were just ahead, gathering supplies for the journey ahead. The hunter, whose name Sarah had learned was Wicasa, moved with the silent precision of someone who had lived in the wild all his life. Tala, on the other hand, seemed to be adjusting to the new reality with cautious optimism. Sarah couldn't help but feel a bond with the young girl. Tala had been through so much in such a short time. Loss, fear, and now, a strange hope that had blossomed from the most unlikely of places. Wicasa had been right. The town was no place for either of them, but Sarah's heart ached knowing that she was now complicit in taking them both further into the wilderness. Her mind wandered back to her own situation. The town had been her prison, but now she had willingly chosen this dangerous path, drawn by the desire to protect these strangers. She had never felt more alive, more connected to something bigger than herself. As they trekked deeper into the woods, the forest seemed to swallow them up, the sounds of the outside world fading away. Sarah had only a rough sense of direction, but Wicasa seemed to know exactly where they were going. Every step felt like a step into the unknown, but there was an undeniable pull to keep moving forward. Wicasa had told Sarah that they were headed toward his tribe's camp, deep in the heart of the forest. It was a place of refuge, he said, where they could find shelter, food, and safety. But Sarah could tell that there was something more to the story. There was a depth to Wicasa's words, a weight that hinted at something darker lurking beneath the surface. Tala, who had been quiet for most of the journey, spoke up suddenly. "Will we be safe there?" Her voice was soft, but laced with a palpable fear. Sarah turned to look at the young girl, her heart breaking. "I think so," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure. She had to believe that they would be. Wicasa glanced at the two of them, his expression unreadable. "Safety is an illusion," he said quietly. "But we have a better chance there than we do out here." His words hung in the air as they continued their trek through the dense underbrush. Hours passed in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of their boots on the forest floor and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was a journey filled with uncertainty, but for Sarah, each step was a small victory. They finally stopped for a brief rest by a small stream. Sarah sat down on a large rock, her legs aching from the long walk. She glanced at Tala, who was carefully examining the water, as if it held some secret she hadn't yet uncovered. Wicasa, meanwhile, knelt beside the stream, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a calm alertness. "We rest here for a while," he said, his voice low and steady. Sarah nodded, grateful for the break. As she sat there, she began to reflect on the path that had led her to this point. She had been an outsider in the town, a woman burdened by the weight of judgment and isolation. But now, as she looked at the two people who had come to rely on her, she realized that she had become something else, a protector, a defender. Her old life seemed so distant now, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Wicasa rose from the stream, his movements fluid and purposeful. "We should move soon," he said. "It's not safe to stay in one place for too long." Sarah felt a twinge of unease, but she nodded. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention to their location. They gathered their things and set off once again, deeper into the wilderness. As they moved through the forest, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made her jump. She tried to push the feeling aside, but it lingered in the back of her mind, gnawing at her. Hours later, just as the sun began to set, they arrived at a small clearing. The firelight of the camp was a welcome sight after the long, tense day. But as they approached, Sarah noticed something strange. There was no one waiting at the campfire, no sign of the tribe. Only the faint smell of burning wood lingered in the air. Wicasa's expression hardened. "Something's wrong," he muttered under his breath. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "This is not our camp," Wicasa said, his tone grim. "Someone else has been here." The three of them stood in the clearing, surrounded by the dense forest, a sense of foreboding settling over them. They weren't alone, and the silence around them seemed to echo with a warning. The night had only just begun, but Sarah already knew the danger was far from over. As the last light of day faded from the sky, the clearing seemed to hold its breath. The absence of any signs of life in the camp was unsettling. The fire, though still burning, gave off a cold light, casting long shadows that twisted unnervingly in the fading daylight. Sarah stood at the edge of the camp, her heart pounding as her eyes scanned the empty surroundings. There was no sign of the tribe, no traces of movement, and no familiar voices calling out. Wicasa had been silent ever since they arrived, his face set in a hard mask of concentration. Tala, standing beside Sarah, tugged at her sleeve nervously. "What's happening?" she whispered. Sarah felt the weight of the moment press down on her. She wanted to reassure Tala, but the truth was, she didn't know. Wicasa stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the area. "Something's wrong," he muttered, more to himself than to them. Sarah's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" she asked. Wicasa didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched near the edge of the clearing, his sharp eyes scanning the ground. "There's been a disturbance here," he said finally, his voice low and tight. But it wasn't just the wind. Someone has been here, and they weren't friendly. Sarah felt a cold shiver run through her. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, the stillness pressing in like a vice. "We need to move," Wicasa said, standing up abruptly. "Now." Without waiting for a response, he turned and moved swiftly toward the tree-line, signaling for Sarah and Tala to follow. The forest, which had seemed peaceful only hours before, now felt like a maze of shadows and potential dangers. As they hurried through the woods, The crackling of the underbrush beneath their feet seemed deafening. Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened to the camp. Where had everyone gone? Why were they not waiting for them as they had agreed? Had something gone wrong? Stay close. Wicasa's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and commanding. Tala, looking more scared with each passing step, reached out and grabbed Sarah's hand. Sarah squeezed it, offering what little comfort she could. But her own fear was growing, gnawing at her insides. The forest seemed to close in around them, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig felt like a threat. Wicasa led them deeper into the trees, his movements fluid and precise. Sarah couldn't help but admire his calmness in the face of the unknown. He had lived in these woods longer than she could imagine, and yet even he seemed on edge. It wasn't long before they came upon a small, hidden shelter, just a crude lean-to made of branches and leaves. Wicasa motioned for them to enter. "We'll rest here for the night," he said, his voice soft now, but still filled with tension. Inside the shelter, the air was cooler, but the quiet seemed even more oppressive. Sarah sat down on the damp earth, trying to steady her breathing. Tala, exhausted from the day's journey, curled up beside her, her small body shaking slightly. Wicasa, standing outside the shelter, stared out into the dark woods, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. Sarah could tell he was listening for something, his senses sharpened to a level she could only hope to understand. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Wicasa turned toward her, his face unreadable. "We wait," he said simply, "and we listen." The night passed in silence, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves or distant cry of an animal. Sarah couldn't sleep, her mind spinning with unanswered questions. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the empty camp again, the fire burning but no one there to tend it. She thought about the people she had left behind in the town, the ones who had called her a monster. Now, as she sat in the cold, dark forest, she felt the weight of her decisions. What was she really running from? What had brought her here? Hours passed, and the tension in the air only grew. Wicasa remained outside, alert and watchful, while Sarah tried to comfort Tala, who was drifting in and out of sleep. At some point, Sarah could no longer resist the urge to go outside and check on Wicasa. She slipped quietly out of the shelter and walked toward him, her footsteps light on the soft forest floor. Wicasa turned as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Is it safe?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "For now," he said. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, that made Sarah's heart race. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. Wicasa glanced at her, then down at the ground. "We are not alone," he said softly, as though he were speaking to himself. Sarah felt the weight of his words hit her like a punch. She had hoped the worst was over, that the camp had been a fluke, that they could rest. But Wicasa's warning made it clear that they were not safe yet. The forest had never felt more alive with the potential for danger. And Sarah knew, deep down, that the worst was yet to come. The night dragged on, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and unseen threats. Sarah sat with Tala inside the shelter, the young girl curled up close to her for warmth, but sleep eluded them both. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath, every rustle of leaves a warning, every distant animal call a reminder that they were not alone. Wicasa had kept his vigil, his presence like a silent sentinel at the edge of their temporary refuge. The night felt endless, the air thick with the promise of something more. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She tried to push the thought away, telling herself that it was just the nervous energy of being out in the wild, so far from the town she had once called home. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and something about the way the night felt, too quiet, too still, set her on edge. As the hours passed, Sarah's thoughts drifted back to the town, to the life she had left behind. She had been a prisoner there, bound by the cruel judgment of others, but now, in the wilderness, she realized she was no longer just running from the town. She was running from herself. What had she truly escaped? What was she searching for in the woods? Her gaze fell to Tala, whose eyes were now closed, the girl lost in sleep despite the tension in the air. She was safe, for now. Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep responsibility for this child, a responsibility she hadn't expected to feel. In a world where survival was the only rule, the thought of protecting another human being seemed almost foolish. But there was no denying the bond that had formed between them. Tala needed her, and Sarah, despite her own uncertainty, was determined to be there for her. Wicasa's voice broke through her thoughts. It's time to move. Sarah looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. He had been standing by the edge of the shelter, his posture rigid and tense. What's wrong? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Wicasa's eyes met hers, dark and unreadable. We're not alone. They're coming. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Who? She asked, her voice trembling despite herself. Wicasa didn't answer immediately. He turned and moved to Tala's side, gently shaking the girl awake. We have to go now, he said. Tala stirred, groggy and confused. But when she saw the urgency in Wicasa's face, she immediately sat up, her eyes wide with fear. What's happening? She whispered, clutching at Sarah's side. Stay close, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. We're going to be okay. Wicasa didn't wait for them to gather their things. He moved quickly, almost silently, through the trees. Sarah grabbed Tala's hand and followed as quickly as she could. The forest seemed to close in around them, the once familiar path now a maze of shadows and creeping danger. Wicasa led them further into the woods, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. As they moved, Sarah felt her heart race. The air felt heavier with each step, the silence more oppressive. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Who was coming for them? And why? Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into the unknown, further away from the safety they had briefly felt. Sarah glanced back, but there was nothing behind them but the darkness of the forest. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the threat of something unseen. She reached out to take Tala's hand, squeezing it tightly. Stay close, no matter what. Tala nodded, her face pale and fearful, but she held Sarah's hand tightly, as though drawing strength from her. What are we running from? Tala asked, her voice small and scared. I don't know, Sarah answered truthfully, her voice tight. But we'll be okay. We just have to keep moving. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor. Every now and then, Sarah would glance at Wicasa, but his face remained stoic, unreadable. He didn't speak again, but his every movement was calculated and precise. It was clear that he was preparing for something, but Sarah didn't know what. The forest seemed to grow darker with each passing minute. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the looming promise of danger. After what felt like an eternity, Wicasa stopped suddenly, raising a hand to signal for them to halt. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around, but the forest was still. Too still. We need to find shelter, Wicasa said quietly, his voice a low murmur. They will be here soon. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Who? She asked again, the question more urgent this time. Wicasa didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched down, scanning the ground. After a moment, he stood up and motioned for them to follow him. They're close. Stay low, stay quiet. Sarah and Tala followed him, their steps silent as they moved through the dense forest. Wicasa led them to a small cave, barely visible against the rocky terrain. He crouched in front of the entrance, looking back at Sarah. We'll wait here, he said. We'll be safe for now. Sarah nodded, but the doubt in her mind refused to fade. She knew they weren't safe yet, and she knew that the danger they were facing was far from over. The cave was cold and damp, its walls lined with jagged rocks that seemed to press in on them from all sides. Sarah sat on the ground, her knees pulled up to her chest as she stared into the darkness beyond the entrance. The quiet was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of rustling leaves or a distant snap of a branch, reminding them all that they weren't alone. Tala sat beside her, huddled close for warmth. Wicasa, who had remained outside for the better part of the night, now crouched in the shadows just inside the cave, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest with a watchful intensity. His presence was like a constant reminder that danger was never far. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the events of the last few days. The empty camp, the unsettling silence of the forest, Wicasa's cryptic warnings. Who were these people chasing them? What did they want? And why had they been waiting for them at the camp? The questions swirled in her mind, but every time she thought she might find an answer, another fear would rise up to take its place. The forest outside felt like a living thing, its shadows moving with purpose, its silence too deep to be natural. The unknown stretched out before them, and for the first time since she had left the town, Sarah felt the weight of her decisions press down on her. She had run from the people who had called her a monster, from the life that had held her in its grip, but now, out here in the wilderness, she wasn't sure she had escaped anything at all. "We'll be safe here, for now," Wicasa said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a hardness to it that Sarah couldn't ignore. He glanced over at her, his expression unreadable. "They'll be looking for us, but they won't find us right away." "Who are they?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Wicasa didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the trees outside. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice low. "Raiding parties. They're after something, but I don't know what." His eyes flickered briefly to Tala, who was now sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest, her face pale with fear. "They're not the only danger out here," he added, his words making Sarah's stomach tighten. "There are others who will come looking for you, for both of you. They won't stop until they find you." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "Why me?" she asked, her voice rising despite her best efforts to remain calm. Wicasa turned to look at her, his dark eyes sharp and steady. "You're not just running from your past," he said, his words deliberate. "You've come into something much bigger than yourself. And now, you're in it. Whether you like it or not." Sarah shook her head, confused and more than a little scared. "What do you mean?" "You were meant to find us," he said simply. "The tribe, the people you're running from, the ones who would harm you. They're all connected. It's not just coincidence that you're here." His words hung heavy in the air. Sarah felt a chill run through her, but she didn't know how to respond. What did Wicasa mean by meant to find us? And what did it have to do with the raiders, the town, and the tribe he spoke of? She was starting to feel like she was caught in the middle of something far larger than she could ever have imagined. Tala's soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Do you think they'll find us here?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. Wicasa didn't answer right away. He stood up and moved toward the entrance of the cave, crouching low as he peered through the narrow opening. His face was set in a mask of concentration. "We'll be fine for now," he said finally. "But we can't stay here too long. It's only a matter of time before they track us down." "Where do we go?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. Wicasa turned back to look at her, his expression unreadable. "We go where it's safe," he said. "But that's not something I can explain to you yet. You'll understand when the time comes." Sarah nodded, but her mind was spinning. She had no idea what he meant, but she could tell by the look in his eyes that this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that had been set in motion long before she had ever stepped foot in Blackstone. As the hours passed, the silence in the cave grew heavier, the darkness outside pressing in closer. The faint sounds of the forest, branches swaying in the wind, distant calls from animals, did little to reassure Sarah. Every minute felt like an eternity. Wicasa remained on watch, his senses alert as he waited for any sign of danger. Tala eventually fell asleep, her small body curled up against Sarah for warmth. Sarah, however, couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Wicasa had said. "You were meant to find us." What did that even mean? She had no answers, only more questions, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep running without knowing the truth. The forest outside was still, the night dark and full of potential danger. Sarah could feel the weight of it all pressing in on her as she sat in the cave, her thoughts swirling. Whatever lay ahead, she knew one thing for sure. Nothing in her life was ever going to be the same again. The next morning, the air was thick with tension as the first light of dawn filtered weakly through the trees. Sarah sat in the cave, her body aching from the cold ground, but it was the weight of uncertainty that felt heaviest. Tala was still sleeping, curled up next to Sarah for warmth, her breath soft and shallow in the quiet cave. Wicasa, however, had been awake for hours, his eyes sharp and unblinking, scanning the forest outside for any sign of danger. His stillness was unnerving, a constant reminder that there was more to this world than what Sarah had ever imagined. As the sun began to rise, Wicasa finally turned to Sarah, his expression grim. "We have to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What's happened?" she asked, rising to her feet, the cold air making her shiver. Wicasa stepped toward the entrance, his face shadowed with a mixture of anger and concern. "They're close," he said simply. "Too close." Sarah's stomach tightened. She had known they weren't safe, but hearing it from Wicasa made it all too real. The raiders, whoever they were getting closer, and Wicasa had no intention of waiting around to see what would happen next. He moved toward Tala and gently shook her awake. "Tala, it's time," he said softly. The young girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Wicasa, then at Sarah, confusion evident on her face. "What's happening?" she whispered, rubbing her eyes. "We need to leave," Wicasa said. "Now." Sarah didn't wait for any more explanations. She grabbed Tala's hand and led her out of the shelter, the cold morning air hitting her face as they stepped into the woods. The sky was pale blue, and the air smelled of damp earth, but there was something ominous about the silence around them. Wicasa moved ahead, his footsteps sure and quiet, while Sarah kept close behind, Tala's small hand in hers, her grip tight with fear. The woods were eerily still, and Sarah could feel the tension in the air. Every sound, every rustle of the leaves, seemed amplified in the quiet of the forest. They moved quickly, staying off the main paths and using the dense trees for cover. Wicasa didn't speak, but Sarah could feel the urgency in his movements. They had to get away. As they moved deeper into the forest, the thick canopy of trees provided some shelter from the rising sun. The air grew cooler as they climbed higher, the terrain becoming more rugged and uneven. Sarah's legs burned as she pushed herself forward, the thought of the raiders haunting her every step. She kept looking back, half expecting to see figures emerging from the shadows, but the forest remained quiet, too quiet. After what felt like hours, they reached a small ridge overlooking a valley. Wicasa stopped and motioned for them to crouch down. "We'll rest here for a moment," he whispered, his eyes scanning the valley below. Sarah crouched next to him, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of his words sinking in. They were being hunted. "Do you think they're still following us?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Wicasa didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes fixed on the valley, his gaze steady. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low. "They'll follow us as long as we're moving. They'll stop at nothing to find us." The words sent a chill through Sarah, and for the first time, she realized just how dangerous their situation was. They weren't just running from a town that had rejected her. They were running from something far more dangerous. Wicasa stood up slowly, motioning for Sarah and Tala to do the same. "We need to keep moving," he said. "The longer we stay in one place, the easier it will be for them to find us." Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She didn't want to ask more questions. She didn't want to know everything just yet. All she knew was that Wicasa had kept them alive so far, and she had to trust him. They moved on, their pace quickening as the day wore on. The forest began to thin out, and Sarah could see the outlines of a river in the distance. Wicasa led them toward it, the sound of rushing water growing louder as they approached. When they reached the river, Wicasa knelt down beside the bank, dipping his fingers into the cool water. "We'll cross here," he said, standing up and turning to face Sarah. "It will cover our tracks." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with fear, but she knew it was their only chance. They crossed the river quietly, the cold water rushing around their legs, but Sarah barely noticed the chill. All that mattered was getting to the other side. As they reached the opposite bank, Wicasa looked up, his expression hard. "We'll rest here for the night," he said. "But we cannot stay long." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She didn't know what they were running from, but she knew that staying put wasn't an option. They were out of time. The night was falling quickly, and the darkness of the forest seemed to press in on them. Wicasa moved into the trees, setting up a small campfire, and Sarah sat down next to Tala, trying to steady her breath. "We're safe for now," Wicasa said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the fire crackling. But Sarah wasn't sure. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. The only thing she knew for certain was that tomorrow would bring more danger, more uncertainty, and they would have to keep running, keep moving, until they were far from whatever had chased them into the woods. And for the first time, she wasn't sure where they were going or how they would survive. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to the edge of everything. She took a deep breath, holding on to the one thing that kept her moving forward: hope. The fire crackled softly in the night, casting flickering shadows against the trees around them. Wicasa kept his watch by the edge of the small camp, his back straight, eyes scanning the dark forest. The night had fallen heavily around them, and with each gust of wind, Sarah could feel the weight of the uncertainty pressing in. Tala had finally fallen asleep, curled up in Sarah's arms, but Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't silence the questions that kept bubbling to the surface. Why had they been so close to the camp? What was it that had made them run so suddenly? The raiders were still out there, still tracking them. She could feel it in her bones. She wanted to ask Wicasa more, to understand what they were facing, but the silence between them had become a heavy thing. She looked at him now, sitting silently by the fire, the shadows on his face deeper than before. Finally, she couldn't hold it in anymore. "Wicasa," she said quietly, her voice barely louder than the crackling of the fire. "Who are these people? Why are they after us?" Wicasa didn't turn to look at her right away. For a long moment, he just stared into the flames, his face unreadable. Sarah waited, holding her breath. Then, without looking at her, he spoke. "They are not just raiders," he said, his voice low, almost distant. "They are part of something much older. They seek what we have." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "What do we have?" she asked, confused. Wicasa finally turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "You. And your past." Sarah blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "My past," she repeated. Wicasa nodded slowly. "You are not the person they think you are," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "There is more to your story than what they've been told, and they want to use that against you." Sarah felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. She didn't understand. Her life had been simple until now. She had never thought of herself as someone important, just a woman, running from a past she couldn't escape. But now, Wicasa's words felt like a door opening to something much larger, something she wasn't prepared for. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What are they looking for?" Wicasa hesitated, his gaze shifting away from her, back to the shadows. "I don't know all of it yet," he admitted. "But they are after something ancient. Something tied to your family." Sarah's mind spun. Her family? What could they want with her family? Her father had been a simple farmer, and her mother had never spoken of any great legacy. She had always thought of herself as just another person, caught up in the unforgiving world of frontier life. "I don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "I don't have anything. My family is gone." Wicasa's expression softened slightly. "I know, but they want something more than you realize. And it's not just your life they're after. It's what's buried in your blood." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What?" she whispered. "What are you talking about?" Wicasa stood, moving closer to her, his movements fluid but heavy with purpose. "You are part of a much older story than you know," he said. "Your bloodline has ties to the land that many would kill to control. There are people, dangerous people, who want to use that. They want to harness what your family protected." Sarah's heart raced, a wild pounding in her chest. The idea was impossible. Her? Part of something ancient? "You're telling me that my family was involved in something special?" she asked, her voice almost incredulous. Wicasa's gaze hardened, his face serious. "Yes, your family's history is older than you think. And now, you are the last one left. That's why they're hunting you." The weight of his words settled over Sarah like a blanket of cold dread. She had thought that escaping the town, running away from her past, would bring her freedom. But now, it felt like the past was chasing her, catching up with every step. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Wicasa was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his words were filled with an urgency Sarah hadn't heard from him before. "We keep moving. We can't stay here. They'll be coming soon, and when they do, they won't stop until they find you. We have to get to the tribe. It's the only place you'll be safe." Sarah's mind raced. A tribe? She had no idea where to go or how to find it. But she knew one thing: staying here, in this place, was no longer an option. The feeling of being hunted, of being watched, was too real. She had to keep moving. She had no choice. "How far is it?" she asked, standing up and wiping the dirt from her pants. "We'll travel by night," Wicasa said, looking at the sky, now dark and dotted with stars. "It's safer that way." Sarah nodded, swallowing the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "Then let's go." She turned to Tala, who had woken up during the conversation, her wide eyes filled with questions. "Tala, we're leaving. Stick close to me, and don't make a sound." The young girl nodded, her face pale but determined. As they moved out of the camp, the forest stretched out before them, dark and endless. Wicasa led the way, his steps confident, while Sarah and Tala followed closely behind. The unknown was ahead of them, and though Sarah had no idea where the road would lead, she knew one thing. There was no turning back. Not now. Not when everything she had known was unraveling, and her past had caught up with her. The journey through the dense forest seemed endless. Sarah's legs ached, her body exhausted from the constant motion, but there was no time to rest. Wicasa moved with purpose, cutting through the underbrush with ease, his every step deliberate and quiet. Tala walked beside Sarah, her small hand gripping Sarah's tightly, as if holding on to her was the only thing that kept her going. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in around them, making the world feel smaller with each passing minute. Every now and then, Sarah would glance at Wicasa, hoping for some sign that they were on the right path, but he never spoke. He had grown quieter as the night wore on, his face set in concentration, his eyes scanning every movement in the woods, every rustle in the brush. It was clear that danger was near. They had been walking for hours, the only sound the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot and the distant howls of wolves in the night. Sarah's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The raiders, the tribe, the mystery of her family's past. It was all too much for her to fully understand. But she knew one thing for certain. They were not safe. Not yet. She glanced over at Tala, whose eyes were wide with fear, her face pale under the moonlight. The girl had barely spoken since they left the camp, but Sarah could feel the tension building in her. Tala was terrified, and who could blame her? They were running, hiding in the darkness, unsure of what lay ahead. Sarah wished she could offer some comfort, but the weight of uncertainty was too great. "Wicasa," she finally said, breaking the silence. "How much farther?" He glanced back at her, his face unreadable, and then motioned ahead. "Not far," he said, his voice low but calm. "We're almost there." Sarah nodded, though she didn't fully believe him. She had learned to read the signs in the forest, and something didn't feel right. The air was thick with the scent of danger. They had crossed the river earlier that evening, hoping it would throw off anyone tracking them, but the feeling of being hunted hadn't gone away. It lingered in the air like an invisible weight. As they continued on, Sarah's mind kept returning to the one question she had been too afraid to ask. What did Wicasa mean when he said her family's bloodline was tied to something older? What was it that made them want to track her down? She had no answers, only more questions, but now wasn't the time to ask. Not with danger so close. The path ahead grew narrower, the trees more dense, until they finally reached a small clearing. Wicasa stopped, his body tense, and signaled for them to crouch low. Sarah knelt beside Tala, who looked up at her with wide, scared eyes. "What is it?" Sarah whispered. Wicasa's hand was raised, signaling for them to remain silent. He moved closer to the edge of the clearing, his body blending into the shadows like a shadow itself. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of a distant owl's call. Sarah held her breath, her eyes scanning the dark forest around them. It felt as if every creature, every leaf in the forest was watching them. Wicasa turned back to them and nodded. "They're coming," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay quiet. Stay hidden." Sarah felt a wave of fear wash over her. The raiders were close. She could feel it in her bones. Her heart raced, and she wanted to scream, to run, to fight. But Wicasa's presence held her back. He was calm, focused, and that gave her a measure of comfort. He was their protector now. She had to trust him. Wicasa motioned for them to follow him as he moved swiftly to the far side of the clearing, where a low, narrow cave opened up in the rocks. They crawled inside quickly, and Sarah's heart thudded in her chest as she huddled close to Tala in the small space. The cave was dark, but it offered some shelter from the outside world. Wicasa crouched at the entrance, his eyes focused on the distance, his body poised like a predator waiting for the right moment. Time seemed to stretch on, each second feeling like an eternity. Sarah held her breath, her pulse thudding in her ears, as she strained to hear any sound that might give away the raiders' approach. The night felt alive with the threat of danger, and Sarah couldn't help but think of the life she had left behind in the town. The cruelty, the whispers, the judgment, it all seemed so distant now, a past she couldn't escape, no matter how far she ran. But she had to keep moving. She had to protect Tala. Wicasa's voice cut through the silence. "Stay still," he said, barely audible. "They're close." Sarah nodded. Her eyes locked on Wicasa, her heart pounding in her chest. Every second felt like an eternity, but she knew that they had no choice but to wait. If the raiders found them, there would be no more running, no more hiding. They had come too far. The forest outside felt like it was closing in on them, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. A moment later, she heard the distant sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. Her breath caught in her throat as the sound grew louder. They were getting closer. She turned to Wicasa, her eyes wide with fear. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice steady. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Sarah could feel her heart racing in her chest. Then, as quickly as they had come, the footsteps stopped. Silence filled the air, thick and suffocating. Sarah held her breath, waiting for what would come next. Had they found them? Or had the raiders passed by, unaware of their presence? The answer came soon enough. The soft rustling of leaves, followed by the sound of voices in the distance. They weren't alone. The raiders were here, and there was no way out. The footsteps outside the cave grew louder, closer, sending a wave of tension through Sarah's body. She pressed herself back into the cool stone wall, her heart thudding in her chest. Tala clung to her side, trembling, her wide eyes reflecting the fear they all felt. Wicasa remained motionless at the cave's entrance, his body still, his senses razor-sharp. His silence was unnerving, but it also gave Sarah a strange sense of calm. He was in control, and for the moment, that was enough. The voices outside drifted in with the wind, low and guttural. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, hostile, threatening. She strained her ears, trying to pick up anything that would give her a hint of what they were dealing with. Wicasa's hand went up, signaling for them to stay silent. The footsteps stopped just outside their hiding place, and the forest around them fell into an eerie silence. Sarah held her breath, praying they hadn't been heard. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, without warning, a sharp, guttural voice broke the silence. "They're close," the voice said, barely audible through the thick walls of the cave. Sarah's stomach turned. They were still looking for them. The voices grew louder, now just outside the cave, and Sarah could feel the danger closing in. Wicasa moved slightly, his body poised to act if necessary. The last thing he wanted was to be found here. He had warned them. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. The voices outside continued, but now, there was a certain heaviness to them, as though the raiders were making their final preparations. Sarah's pulse quickened, and she tightened her grip on Tala's hand. The tension in the air was unbearable. Wicasa's eyes met Sarah's for a brief moment, and she saw the quiet resolve in his gaze. He wasn't scared. He was waiting, watching, calculating their next move. But Sarah couldn't help the surge of fear that washed over her. What if they didn't make it out? What if this was the end? The raiders were getting closer. They had no choice but to act. Without a word, Wicasa motioned for them to follow. They crawled out of the cave as silently as they could, moving quickly through the underbrush, staying close to the trees for cover. The air felt thick with the weight of their pursuit, but Sarah forced herself to focus on the path ahead. She had to keep moving. They had to stay ahead of the raiders. They couldn't afford to stop, not now. As they crept through the woods, Sarah could hear the faint crackle of leaves beneath heavy boots, the unmistakable sound of people moving, searching. The raiders weren't far behind. Wicasa led them deeper into the forest, his movements swift and sure. Sarah followed, doing her best to keep up, her legs burning from the effort. Tala was quiet now, too frightened to speak. The sounds of the raiders seemed to fade into the distance, but Sarah knew they couldn't slow down. Every step, every second counted. Wicasa led them to a dense thicket, a perfect hiding place. He gestured for them to crouch down, and they huddled together, waiting in the thick darkness of the woods. The silence in the thicket was almost suffocating, and Sarah could feel the weight of her own breathing in the stillness. They waited, the sound of their hearts beating in their chests, the only noise that filled the air. Sarah's mind raced, but she tried to calm herself. She had to trust Wicasa. He knew what he was doing. As they waited, Sarah's thoughts drifted back to the past few days. the way everything had changed so quickly. She had left the town, left everything behind, thinking she could escape the past. But now it seemed like the past was catching up with her faster than she could outrun it. The tribe, the raiders, her family's bloodline. She had no answers, only a deep sense of unease. What did it all mean? And why was she the one being chased? Her thoughts were interrupted by Wicasa's low voice. "They're gone," he said softly. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she dared to breathe a sigh of relief. "For now," Wicasa added. "But we can't stay here long. We move again at first light." Sarah nodded, too tired to argue, but the fear still lingered. She knew they weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. Wicasa remained on alert, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Tala had fallen asleep, her small body leaning against Sarah's, but Sarah remained wide awake, the uncertainty of the situation keeping her alert. She watched Wicasa, studying the way he moved, the way he never let his guard down. It was clear that he was prepared for anything, but Sarah couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep running. How long could they stay ahead of the raiders? Her thoughts swirled, but she knew one thing. They couldn't afford to stop now. They had to keep moving, keep fighting, no matter what. The danger wasn't over. And as the night stretched on, Sarah knew that the road ahead would be even harder than the one behind. But she would face it. For Tala. For herself. She couldn't afford to give up now. With Wicasa by their side, she felt a strange sense of strength, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. But deep down, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. The night passed in tense silence, the stillness of the forest pressing in on them from every side. Sarah lay awake, her body exhausted, but her mind spinning with the uncertainty of what was to come. Wicasa remained vigilant, his eyes scanning the darkness, ever watchful, as though he never slept. Tala had drifted into a restless slumber beside her, the young girl curled tightly into a ball, still trembling from the fear of being hunted. Sarah tried to close her eyes, but the thoughts of the raiders, of the bloodline Wicasa spoke of everything she had left behind, wouldn't let her rest. She wanted answers, but she was afraid of what they might reveal. She glanced at Wicasa again, his face unreadable, his presence a silent strength that kept her grounded, despite the chaos of her thoughts. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the trees, Wicasa stood, moving with the quiet precision that had become second nature to him. His movements seemed fluid, almost like he was one with the forest, as though the woods had accepted him as their own. "We move," he said simply, his voice low but firm. Sarah didn't question it. She had learned to follow his lead. They couldn't afford to waste time. Tala woke groggily, rubbing her eyes, and Sarah stood up, helping the girl to her feet. "Come on, we have to keep going," Sarah said softly. Tala nodded, still looking a little lost, but following Sarah's lead without question. Wicasa was already moving through the trees, his steps light and purposeful. As they made their way through the forest, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig made her heart skip a beat. She wanted to ask Wicasa what they were running from exactly, but she knew that he would only say what he had already told her. They were after something much bigger than them. She could feel the weight of his words in her chest, a heavy burden that seemed to press on her with every step. The forest felt different now, darker somehow, as though it were closing in around them. The path they had taken the night before seemed to be fading, and they were moving deeper into unknown territory. Sarah had never been this far out in the wilderness, and a part of her wondered if they were heading towards something worse, something she couldn't yet comprehend. Wicasa had led them deeper and deeper, until the trees were so thick that they barely saw the sky above. The air grew cooler as they moved higher into the mountains, and the terrain became more rugged, the ground uneven and rocky beneath their feet. Sarah struggled to keep up, but Tala kept pace beside her, her small hand gripping Sarah's tightly, as though she was drawing strength from the older woman's presence. "How much farther?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with exhaustion. Wicasa didn't answer immediately. He continued to move ahead, his eyes scanning the forest around them, alert to any danger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stopped, his gaze fixed on something ahead. "We're close," he said, turning to face Sarah and Tala. "But we need to be careful. This is where they'll be watching." Sarah's stomach tightened at the mention of they. She knew Wicasa was referring to the raiders, but she also knew that whatever was coming for them was more than just a group of hunters. They were being pursued by something much larger, something connected to her bloodline, and that thought terrified her more than anything. They moved cautiously now, stepping lightly through the forest, trying to make as little noise as possible. Wicasa led them to a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees, where a narrow stream flowed gently through the center. The sound of the water was soothing, but it also felt like a trap. "Stay here," Wicasa said, his voice low. "I'll scout ahead." Sarah nodded, though a part of her wanted to protest. She didn't want to be left alone, especially not in a place that felt so vulnerable. But she didn't argue. Wicasa knew the forest better than she ever could, and if there was any hope of getting out alive, she had to trust him. Wicasa disappeared into the woods, his figure vanishing into the trees like a shadow. Sarah sat down by the stream, her eyes constantly scanning the forest for any sign of danger. Tala sat beside her, her small body tense and her eyes wide with fear. Sarah reached out and took the girl's hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll be okay," she said, though her own words felt hollow. How could she promise that when she wasn't sure herself? Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, every second dragging by as they waited for Wicasa to return. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with an ominous silence. Sarah's heart raced in her chest, and the quiet only made her more aware of the dangers that surrounded them. What if the raiders had already found them? What if Wicasa wasn't coming back? The thought gnawed at her, but she forced herself to stay calm, to keep her focus. Finally, after what felt like hours, Wicasa returned, his movements swift and purposeful. He didn't speak at first, but his eyes met Sarah's, and she could see the grim determination in them. "It's time to move," he said simply. "We don't have much time. They'll be here soon." Sarah stood, her legs shaky from the strain of the journey. Tala stood beside her, and without a word, they followed Wicasa once more, moving quickly through the dense forest. The sound of the stream was replaced by the crunch of leaves beneath their feet as they continued on, knowing that whatever lay ahead, they had no choice but to face it. The forest was no longer just a place of refuge. It had become a battleground, and as they moved deeper into it, Sarah realized that there was no turning back. The danger was closing in, and all they could do was keep moving forward. The journey through the forest grew more intense with every passing moment. The sounds of the woods, which had once been soothing, now felt oppressive. Every rustle, every whisper of wind through the trees seemed like a signal of danger, a reminder that they were not alone. Wicasa led them through the thick underbrush with practiced ease, but Sarah's heart raced with each step. Her body ached from the long days of travel, but it was the tension in the air that made her feel truly exhausted. The raiders were still out there, hunting them. They had no idea how far ahead the raiders were, or what they might be planning, but Sarah knew one thing for certain. They could not afford to stop. Wicasa had made it clear they were being hunted not just for survival, but for something far bigger, something tied to her bloodline, something she hadn't fully understood yet. As they moved through the dense trees, Sarah glanced at Tala, walking quietly beside her. The girl was pale, her small face drawn with exhaustion and fear. It was hard for Sarah to ignore the weight of responsibility she felt. She had promised to protect Tala, to keep her safe, but it seemed like the danger was only growing. They were moving deeper into the wilderness, away from the town, away from the past, but also further into unknown territory. Sarah had never ventured this far into the woods before. She wasn't sure if she even knew where they were going. Wicasa hadn't said much since they left their last shelter, and Sarah had learned not to press him for answers. But she couldn't shake the questions swirling in her mind. What had she gotten herself into? What did Wicasa mean by her family's bloodline? And what exactly were they running from? After what felt like hours, Wicasa stopped, turning to face them. His expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the sharp focus of a predator. "We need to take cover," he said, his voice low and urgent. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They're close," he said simply. "We need to move quickly." Sarah didn't need to ask who they were. The raiders were closing in. They were no longer just a threat. They were a force bearing down on them with every step, and the closer they got, the less chance they had of escaping. Wicasa led them into a thick patch of trees, where the underbrush grew dense, and they huddled low to the ground, trying to make as little noise as possible. Tala was trembling beside her, her hand tightly gripping Sarah's. Sarah kept her breathing slow and steady, trying to calm herself. Every part of her wanted to run, to escape, but Wicasa's steady presence reminded her that panic wouldn't help them. It would only make things worse. "We wait here," Wicasa said, crouching down and looking out from behind the trees. His eyes were narrow, focused, as though he could see through the darkness itself. "Stay quiet. Don't make a sound." The seconds seemed to stretch on endlessly. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, every beat echoing in her ears. The silence around them felt like a ticking clock, each passing moment a reminder that they were running out of time. She tried to push the fear down, tried to ignore the constant gnawing in her stomach. They had to get out of there. They had to keep moving. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds of footsteps reached Sarah's ears. Heavy, deliberate. The raiders were close. She could feel the air shift as their presence became undeniable. Wicasa shifted slightly, his body tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. He glanced at Sarah, his gaze steady, his eyes telling her everything she needed to know. "Stay still. Don't make a sound." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Sarah could feel her breath catch in her throat. They were right there, so close she could almost reach out and touch them. Wicasa's hand moved subtly, a signal for them to stay low and silent. Sarah looked at Tala, who was holding her breath, her face pale with fear. There was nothing they could do now but wait. The sound of footsteps finally stopped. The forest around them was eerily quiet again. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment in her chest. They weren't out of danger yet. Wicasa remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on something just beyond their hiding spot. Sarah's heart raced. The silence stretched on, and then, in the distance, a voice broke the quiet. "They've got to be close," a man said, his voice rough and low. "We can't let them get away." The voice sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She recognized the tone, hunting, determined. The raiders were right outside, and they were getting closer by the second. Wicasa's eyes flicked to Sarah for a brief moment before he turned his attention back to the forest, every muscle in his body coiled tight, ready for anything. Sarah held her breath. It felt like the world had narrowed to this one moment. If they were found, there would be no escape. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. The tension was unbearable. She couldn't let it break her. Not now. Not when Tala depended on her. The voices outside faded as the men moved further away, and after what felt like an eternity, Wicasa motioned for them to move. "We go now," he whispered. "Stay close, and don't make a sound." They moved swiftly, moving in and out of the shadows, as the raiders' voices grew fainter. Sarah's mind raced with fear, but she focused on the one thing that mattered: survival. They had to keep moving, keep ahead of the raiders. There was no turning back. Not now. With Wicasa leading them, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. They could do this. They had to. The forest had grown unnervingly quiet, the silence only broken by the soft crunch of their footsteps as they moved cautiously through the underbrush. The raiders' voices had faded, but Sarah knew better than to relax. Wicasa was still alert, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, his movements as quiet and precise as ever. They had made it this far, but the real danger was just beginning. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, and every rustling leaf made Sarah's heart race. Tala, though exhausted, kept up with them, her small hand gripping Sarah's tightly. The fear in the girl's eyes hadn't faded, but Sarah tried her best to reassure her with a smile, even though her own stomach twisted with uncertainty. They had to keep moving, had to get farther into the forest, away from the raiders who were still hunting them. There was no question now. This was no ordinary chase. This was about something much more significant, something that reached back into Sarah's past. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel it in her bones. Wicasa had said they needed to reach the tribe, but she wasn't sure how far they had to go, or what the tribe would even mean for them. Would they be welcomed, or would the tribe, too, see her as a threat? The questions gnawed at Sarah, but she couldn't afford to ask them now. The forest grew denser as they continued, the trees towering above them like silent sentinels. The sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy, and the air felt cool and damp, filled with the scent of earth and moss. But despite the chill, Sarah couldn't shake the heat of fear coursing through her. What were they really running from? What had they stumbled into? The answers seemed just out of reach, but she knew that whatever it wasn't something they could outrun. They had to confront it head-on. After what felt like hours, Wicasa stopped abruptly. He held up his hand, signaling for them to stay quiet. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. They had reached a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees, and from the way Wicasa stood, tense and alert, Sarah could tell they were close to something. She stepped forward, trying to peer through the trees to see what had caught Wicasa's attention. It was then that she saw it, figures moving in the distance. At first, they were just shadows among the trees, but as they moved closer, Sarah could make out the shapes of people, their movements swift and deliberate. Raids, Wicasa whispered under his breath. They're scouting the area. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The raiders were still here. They hadn't given up on finding them. What do we do now? She asked, her voice barely audible. Wicasa didn't look at her. Stay still. Don't make a sound. They crouched low to the ground, blending into the shadows. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as the figures drew nearer. They were only a few yards away now. She could hear their voices, low and rough, the language unfamiliar to her ears. Wicasa was tense beside her, his eyes locked on the approaching figures, waiting for the right moment to move. Every instinct in Sarah told her to run, to bolt through the trees and escape, but she knew that if they moved too soon, they would be caught. So she waited. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, but at last, the figures passed, moving in the opposite direction. Wicasa's grip on Sarah's arm tightened, signaling her to stay low and still. As the last of the raiders disappeared into the trees, Wicasa slowly rose, motioning for them to follow. They moved quickly, staying as low as possible, their footsteps silent against the forest floor. Sarah's heart was still racing, but she was more determined than ever. The danger wasn't over yet. They had to keep going. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, and Sarah had no idea where they were headed. But Wicasa had a plan, and for the first time, she allowed herself to trust him completely. They continued through the dense woods, the sounds of the raiders fading behind them. The journey was grueling, but they pushed on, determined to find safety. As the day wore on, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ground. Sarah felt the weight of exhaustion in her bones, but she knew they couldn't stop. Wicasa's steady presence kept them moving, even when they could barely put one foot in front of the other. Finally, as the last traces of sunlight disappeared, they reached a small clearing. Wicasa stopped, his gaze shifting to the trees surrounding them. "This is it," he said, his voice low but steady. "We're almost there." Sarah couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They had made it this far. She couldn't let herself falter now. Wicasa moved forward, parting the underbrush to reveal a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. "We need to keep moving," he said, looking back at Sarah. "We're not safe yet, but this path will take us where we need to go." Sarah nodded, her breath coming in shallow bursts as they continued down the path. The end of their journey was within reach, but she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The answers she sought, the truth about her family and the danger that pursued them, still lay ahead. But now, more than ever, Sarah was ready to face whatever came next. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now.